Welcome back to News Talk. The Washington Nationals late last night were blanked by the Los Angeles Dodgers out on the West Coast. The score 5-0. The loss putting the team 2.5 games behind the first-place New York Mets in the National League East. The Nats are now 5.5 back in the chase for the second wild card spot. Still plenty of time, of course. I like the team's chances of finishing first, even now. Still, this is not where this talent-laden ball club expected to be at this point in the proceedings. Noah Frank is digital sports editor for WTOP and joins us now. Welcome back. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
It seems like one step forward, one step back for the Nationals. It feels like we're trapped in this cycle where they play well, then they lose games that have you scratching your head. They get a player back, he starts to shake off some of the rust, then Bryce Harper hurts his knee. We're in mid-August, and the Nationals, it seems like, are still trying to generate the momentum we hoped they would be, that they would be having right now.
Well, they've had a ton of injuries, and that happens sometimes. Sometimes you have years where guys just get banged up, and if your important guys are out, as when Harper's been out in the past, when he was hurt a lot of 2013, the team underachieved, and this team reminds me a lot of the 2013 team in terms of the fact that they just can't seem to get going. The talent's there, but it doesn't materialize in wins. And a game like last night is going to happen. You run into one of the top two or three pitchers in the National League in Zach Greinke. Like, they got another tough test in Clayton Kershaw tonight. You're going to lose tough games to quality opponents on the road when they have great pitchers going. That's not the problem. The problem is the games that they should win, the games that they have, that they played well enough to win, that they're in position to win, and that they still find a way to lose. That
Colorado series was pretty brutal. I mean, to the extent that games in July can matter with a capital M. You don't want to overthink or overanalyze any of this stuff. But when you're starting to get the pieces back, and you've got a last-place team at home, and you lose 2 of 3, that's not good.
And it's the way that they lost them. I mean, again, it's sometimes a starter just doesn't have it and goes out and you're just trying to cobble together 9 innings to get through. But you had a situation where Colorado has traded away one of their 2 marquee superstars. They're a team without much punch, but they have this great left-handed hitter in the middle of the lineup in Carlos Gonzalez. And you get deep in the game, and the Nats are leading, and they've got the guys they want lined up with Storen and Papelbon. Now that you have Papelbon in the back of the bullpen, but Storen gets himself in trouble, and you have a whole stable of bullpen arms. You got all these lefties down there just sitting around with Carlos Gonzalez getting closer and closer and closer to coming up. Nobody's ready. Nobody's warm. Comes up with the bases loaded, rocks a grand slam off the back wall of the bullpen while everyone sits there and watches it, and the game's gone. And you say, oh, whatever, it's one game. We know how much one game can matter, especially if they end up fighting for a wild card spot, and you're talking about one game to host or one game to just to even get into the playoffs. The problem is that there's been patterns in terms of how they've been managed day to day. They don't seem to be changing. Nobody seems to be learning from the mistakes that have been made.
How troubling are those patterns in your view?
I mean, they're really troubling. When Matt Williams was hired, there was sort of he has the relationship with Mike Rizzo. They knew each other in Arizona. This is a guy who he's comfortable with. It's his personal hire. He was promoted, given a higher title, Rizzo was within the organization, immediately before the Matt Williams hire, to essentially say, you're now the president of baseball operations. This is your hire. And so that seemed good because they have a good relationship. There were times when he and Davey would not necessarily get along that well, and would argue about strategy and whatnot. But I can't imagine that he's actually, as he's publicly stated, been in support of the way that Williams has been handling things, because we saw it from right at the get-go last year in April. There was a game when Tyler Clippard came in, and I wrote about this today for WTOP.com. And he came in, it was literally the first couple weeks of the season against the Angels. The Angels had one good left-handed bench bat, and I knew it. My friend who was an Angels fan knew it. We were talking about it the whole game. Well, that's the only chance that Mike Scioscia has is, when are they going to use Raul Ibanez off the bench? And we talked about it, and the game wore on. It got late, and Clippard got in trouble. And in a tie game in the 8th inning, the bases loaded up. Nobody was ready in the bullpen. And up comes the left-handed slugger, Raul Ibanez, and he hits a bases-clearing double. And that's what happens when the offense is able to throw the guy that they want into that situation. And as a manager, you have to be able to counter that. So a year and a half later, here we are, the exact same situation ostensibly. The base is loaded in the 8th inning against your right-handed 8th inning guy, whatever that really means, and you don't have a left-hander ready to go matchup for matchup to put him, because Carlos Gonzalez crushes right-handed pitching and is really not good at all against left-handed pitching, especially this year.
And he made them pay.
Right, because they just didn't make the move that was right in front of them.
There was a little bit of a head-scratcher, and I realized we're all experts after a loss. I mean, that's got to be in the mix here, is that after a win, the players get the credit, and after a loss, we're all expert coaches. But I think it was in New York, the pitcher Joe Ross got on late in, I think, what was a tie game. It was an obvious pinch run situation. They didn't. They got nothing and they lost. So, again, we're all experts after the fact. We all know exactly what should have happened once the outcome isn't as you would have wanted. But that one I don't think was that wasn't rocket science.
Right. Well, and Davey, when he was managing, used to always say, I don't win games, I only lose games.
Sure.
And I think
that's the old cliche.
Yeah, and I think that the role of the manager is maybe sometimes overblown. I'm not the type of person to immediately jump up and say, oh, fire the manager, everything's wrong. But there is a very specific role for a manager in terms of lineup construction, in terms of bullpen management, day-to-day within the game. The general manager does most of the work in putting the team together. I mean, he's the one out there, pulling the strings to get the players on the field. But there are key pieces to that day-to-day structure. And another one that I talk about is using Michael Taylor, who is a great defensive center fielder, by the way, who by all the metrics is much better than Denard Span at this point in their respective careers, because he's younger, he's faster, he covers more ground. There's nothing wrong with Michael Taylor being your center fielder while Denard Span's hurt. He does an admirable job filling in center field, but he does not get on base, and that's just who he is at this point as a hitter. And for 25 games, he just plugged him into the leadoff spot where Denard Span was.
Right.
Just because your center fielder is hurt doesn't mean that the guy who plays center field in his place also has to bat in his place, especially when he is not the right guy for that. 25 games they jammed him in the leadoff spot. They went 10-15 in those games. They're over 500 when he starts and bats at the bottom of the lineup. I mean, that's all you can ask for. Win more games than you lose when you don't have your starters in there. But I mean, they lost 60% of their games with him in the leadoff spot, and it just every day after day. You have to. Anyone who knows anything about baseball looks at a 287 on base percentage and goes, why is that guy leading off? Rick Anderson wasn't the greatest leadoff hitter because he was fast. It's because he got on base at over 400 for his career. He got on base all the time.
Fans are tired of hearing this, but to play devil's advocate,
sure.
Make the case. Can someone make the case that we should give Matt Williams credit for keeping this team relevant when they've had their what was in the preseason, prior to the start of the year, their starting lineup on paper? We have hardly seen that lineup, if we've seen it at all. So, can there be a legitimate school of thought? Matt Williams is doing a great job stitching, Scotch tape and string on this lineup that has taken one hit after another from an injury perspective.
I mean, we've seen other teams underachieve this year. We like the Marlins. The Marlins have been terrible this year. We thought they were going to be maybe a surprise contender, but they were going to be a fringy team. They were a team that maybe was ready to take a leap forward. This team won 96 games last year. Had Bryce Harper break out this year to have one of the best seasons in baseball history this year. Mm-hmm. And brought in Max Scherzer, who's been completely lights out despite his win totals. But I mean, he's a top 2 or 3 Cy Young contender, guaranteed, if he keeps pitching like this at the end of the year. So you're talking about, you add one of the best pitchers in the National League. Your young star matures into the best player in the National League. Yeah, you've had some injuries, but you're in a terrible division. It's the worst division in baseball. It's really not even that close. And I mean, they're above 500, but I feel like you could kind of just press play on an auto lineup every day, and this team, even with the injuries, would be a 500 ball club.
I only have a couple seconds left for this segment. Just because a player's back doesn't mean he's going to produce. That said, I think a lot of Nats fans like the way Ryan Zimmerman seems to be rounding back into form. As my friend Tom Threlkeld likes to say, you can't have a first baseman hitting 210.
Right. Yeah, Ryan Zimmerman looks better. People tend to forget about this, but Ryan Zimmerman has always been this incredibly streaky hitter. He'll go for 3 weeks and he'll light the world on fire, and you'll remember why he was the 5th overall pick, and then he'll kind of disappear for a month, and then he'll come right back. So if we're seeing one of these hot streaks, it's coming at a really good time. The real concern is Jason Worth. Because Jason Worth was the worst player by OPS in the National League before he went on the disabled list.
Wow.
And he's been worse than that since he's come back.
I'm talking with Noah Frank, sports editor at WTOP, WTOP.com. A break here, back with more News Talk right after this. 13 before the hour now. Thanks for staying with us as we continue our conversation with our friend Noah Frank of WTOP and WTOP.com. The Geno Smith story rocketed around the country via social media and other means really rapidly, and it was one of those things where in a nanosecond everyone's talking about this thing, him getting socked in the jaw by a teammate who's immediately bounced out of the locker room, given the heave-ho. Smith out 6 to 10 weeks with a broken jaw on which he's had or is going to have surgery. A big deal because it happened in New York and it got overcovered as things in New York do, or just because of what this moment was?
I think it's a big deal anywhere, especially when it's the Jets and the history the Jets have, especially the history the Jets have with quarterbacks and butt fumbles and everything else that's happened in the last 5-10 years with them. I think that it gets magnified a bit, but I heard a head coach talk about this recently. We saw the little scuffles at training camp. For people who watched Hard Knocks last night, they saw what happened at Redskins camp with the Texans last week. I think that these things happen more than people realize. They happen in locker rooms behind closed doors, and usually the guy just doesn't get hit squarely in the jaw and actually gets put out for a while.
Sucker punch,
right?
By a huge guy.
Yeah, and we weren't there. We don't know exactly how it went down, but usually a couple guys get in a scuffle, and it's a scuffle, and it's not a big deal. Obviously, you take out the starting quarterback for the first quarter of the season or whatever it's going to end up being, it becomes headline news.
I don't want to make too much of this one thing, but taken in the context of what's been a brutal and I think troubling period for the league, some trivial things that are mishandled like Deflategate and all the non-trivial things that go right to the core of who we are as individuals and who we want our institutions to be, et cetera, et cetera. Are the people that you talk to, maybe not so much your friends who are like sports 24/7, but people in a broader, sort of realm, if you will, of who you interact with. Are you talking to people, as I am, who are sort of rethinking their commitment, if you will, to the league?
Yeah, I think this sort of
football, to pro football in America.
I think this sort of automatic, oh yeah, let's get ramped up, I can't wait, like how did I live without Monday Night Football every Monday? Like that sort of sentiment that was there maybe 10 years ago isn't quite as much anymore. I still watch games most weeks. Some weeks I watch more college games than I do pro games anymore, and I care more about the college games than the pro games anymore. And that might be more of a personal thing, but I remember a shift for myself about five years ago. The whole Brett Favre on retirement thing was sort of wearing on me, and now with this last year of off the field incidents being really put under a microscope, and the league's mishandling of disciplinary measures, and then scrambling and showing us that they really weren't prepared to deal with this, and they're trying to make up some ground now and trying to hire people who actually know what they're doing, and but a Geno Smith incident I think is the kind of thing that we just expect to happen in football. It's all the other stuff that's sort of taken away.
To me, there is without question mixed evidence about sort of the health and the well-being and the state of the game right now, and how fans, particularly people who've regarded pro football to be, far and away their number one go-to when it comes to sports and their rooting passions and stuff like this. On the one hand, I've never known a time, and I've watched pro football 40 plus years, I've never known a time where more people are kind of reassessing their commitment and how much of themselves they invest in their team and just pro football generally. But by the same token, the numbers suggests there may not be that much wrong. The ratings, and ProFootballTalk.com had this the other day, the ratings for the Hall of Fame game, which is a meaningless, all the exhibition games are meaningless, but this is the first one, the starters don't play, it's the ultimate who cares, and they drew a bigger rating than Game 6 of the NHL Stanley Cup Finals. That tells you something in terms of the hierarchy.
Yeah, well, I mean, football is unquestionably number one still. It's still very, very popular. The interesting thing to sort of keep an eye on as we move forward, there was the Business Journal released that study yesterday, and of the declining sports among youth athletes in the last 5 years, football was the third biggest decline at 18%. Almost 20% less, fewer kids enrolled in football over the last 5 years. And that's going to start to show up slowly, but it means lower talents for high school, lower talents for college, lower talent in the NFL. It means less kids buying jerseys and less kids going to games because they're not as invested in it as they would be if they were playing. You lose your hardcore fan base, not just kids who would end up in the NFL, but all the thousands of kids who play for every one kid who does end up in the NFL. Reducing that number across the country by thousands or even millions of kids over a generation. We've heard politicians talk about not letting their kids play. It's become a public issue where, as we see the health effects of, especially with these major concussion lawsuits and the CTE lawsuits, I think that there's a long-term problem for the NFL that certainly you don't see right now, but I think it's going to start to creep in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Noah Frank, digital sports editor at WTOP. Find his work at WTOP.com. Always good to have you here. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks again.
See you next time. Back with a program note after this.